living with epilepsy and what it's like to have a seizure. Plus,
hello, everyone. Welcome to this edition of 12 on Health. You're watching News 12 Connecticut, as local news gets. Now, in many ways, epilepsy is a huge mystery. It's known as a neurological condition that affects the nervous system, and it's known for the seizures patients have. But doctors and other researchers say very often they're stumped by what causes the condition. It affects about 60,000 people in southwestern Connecticut. Our guest now, Robert Fiore, is an epilepsy patient who's very active in generating awareness of epilepsy, and he's here with top neurosurgeon Dr. Ken Vives, who comes to us from Yale New Haven Hospital. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you for having us.
It's very generous of you to share the experience, because I know it's not easy to live day to day with epilepsy.
That's true, it isn't. And I'm 53. It was discovered that when I was 9 months old. That's when I had my first seizure. And I've had it naturally all my life. And the beauty of today is the fact that it could be addressed in many ways through surgery, different medications,
yes.
etc.
You went for surgery, but prior to all that, tell us what you do know of the seizures you've had.
With the exception of two, there's only, I've never knew when a seizure is oncoming. It's always after the fact. Someone walks up to you and they have that look on their face. I'm like, okay, what happened?
Right.
And they explain to you what it was.
I read that in some cases people get a weird smell or taste going right before their seizure.
Yeah, I've heard that from others too. Myself, that hasn't happened.
So it really blindsided you.
Exactly.
Have you had a seizure since your surgery?
One. Since the surgery. But
was it a serious one or a mild one?
It was kind of serious. The reason that happened, though, is I'm going through a weaning process of lowering the amount of medication I take every day.
Okay.
And it's kind of like a trial and error thing. And so we found out that day, can't cut back that much.
Dr. Vives, let's back up a little. What's going on in the brain that would cause this?
Right. Well, seizures are caused by a number of different things. And if we just look at a definition of what a seizure is, there's an abnormal excitation that occurs with the brain, and there's just excess activity, as well as sometimes it's hypersynchronous, where there's too much activity all at once going on over and over again in the brain. And then epilepsy is a condition that consists of recurrent seizures.
So that's really the main definition, more than two seizures.
That's correct.
So there's really no way of knowing what has brought it on in the first place?
Well, there are a number of different things that can initiate a seizure, and not all individual seizures eventually lead to epilepsy. So in children, things like a fever can initiate their first seizure. In adults, it could be something like trauma. Other times, there's an underlying problem with the brain that's causing the seizures, and then it's the epilepsy. So tumors, developmental disorders, infections, all of these things can lead to epilepsy.
If you know enough to isolate in some patients where the seizures are coming from in the brain. Tell us about how you do that.
Well, there are a number of different tests that we can do. Part of it is really just finding out what the patient experiences. Certain types of seizures come from certain areas of the brain, and that can oftentimes be the most leading thing that tells us where the brain is abnormal. Other times we have to bring patients into the hospital and record their seizures, both on video so that we can see what's going on, as well as recording the electrical activity of the brain through an EEG.
So, Robert, you had to undergo this testing before you could possibly undergo surgery.
Right, because they went through 5 different tests to see if I was a candidate for that.
They wanted to isolate where in your brain the seizures were coming from.
Exactly.
But they couldn't get a seizure out of you.
Well, during one of the tests, everything was very, very relaxed. They did take away part of the medication, and still nothing really provoked a seizure. So they took more away, and I did some exercise, etc., and that really provoked it. Because
they had to take the medication away to sort of prompt us or allow you to have the seizure you might normally have, did that scare you coming off your medication?
No, I really made up my mind to do it. I figure it's going to work out not only for myself if I was able to get the surgery, but they could focus on it for other people too.
Tell us about the surgery.
Well, there's a number of different things that allow us to bring a patient to surgery. Like for Robert's case, we can record from the surface of the brain and do certain structural imaging studies that allow us to look at what's going on in the brain, not only what might be wrong structurally, but also metabolically and chemically what might be going on in the brain. And there are a number of different tests that allow us to do that.
You found the very area, though, where these seizures are stemming from?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. In some patients, we have to actually record from the surface of the brain through a separate surgical procedure where we open up the brain and put electrodes right on the surface of the brain and then do the same kind of thing where the patients are recorded to find out where the seizures are exactly coming from.
The electrodes on his scalp worked for you?
Yes.
And what part of his brain did you remove?
The temporal lobe.
And success? I mean, how do you know?
Right.
He's had one seizure since.
So we recognize that there are some patients that over time may relapse and have seizures. In general, though, what we found, even at looking very long-term data, that patients that undergo this surgery have a great success at least reducing their seizures.
Medication than they started with. Okay. But in general, if we can impact the patient's seizures,
by reducing them greatly or eliminating, it makes a huge difference in their life.
Right. So when you had that seizure more recently, you didn't feel like your surgery was...
More recently, you didn't feel like your surgery was a failure?
Oh, by no means. I'm so much better than before. And ironically, when you said, when you remember when you had a seizure, that was the one time where something was happening. I noticed when I was at the computer typing away, my arm kept moving to one side. I'm like, this is ridiculous.
So
What's
there was a
going on?
sign this last one.
And it took a few seconds to figure out, let's go lie down and get ready to call 911.
Good for you.
Luckily, my wife had come home. I asked her to come upstairs, and she had already called 911.
One last question for you. What's the hardest thing about living with epilepsy?
The stigma that's out there. Being born in the 50s, the stigma was really great. Trying to get around, date people, etc., looking for work.
People think you're just unable to function in the real world?
Yeah, unfortunately. But it's changed over the years, I got to say, and more people are open about it. I give younger people today a lot of credit because you can see them at different functions. You can see them on YouTube, and they speak about it very openly.
Yes.
And
that has a lot to do with folks like you getting the word out.
Absolutely.
Because I think people hear epilepsy, very few of us understand what it's all about and say, ooh,
Yeah.
And what about a seizure? It's very scary to someone who's never, been around that.
Because they don't want to talk about that.
Right.
But
being
here